Section 25 of The Wars of the Roses by Robert Balmain Mowat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 18. The Troubled Years of King Edward, Part 3. The spring of 1470 saw many sudden changes in England. Edward moved resolutely against the rebels, and everyone knew that although he might be dilatory and careless for long periods, yet once he was started on an enterprise, he was likely to finish it successfully. At the beginning of March, it was known that the king was going in person into Lincolnshire. It was supposed that the Earl of Warwick would accompany him. But although summoned to the king's host, Warwick and Clarence preferred to remain in Warwick Castle, from which they might effect a junction with the insurgents who were coming south. But Edward's movements were too rapid. He marched toward Lincolnshire. On March 12th he met the rebels at Eppingham in Rutlandshire. The king had a good following. It was said that there were never seen in England so many goodly men and so well arrayed in a field. The success which always seemed to follow the king when he went into battle attended him now. The rebels made no stand. The royal artillery tore through their ranks, and from the precipitation with which they fled, the battle became known as Lose Coat Field, for the Lincolnshire men threw away their coats the lighter to run away. Sir Robert Welles and 3 of his men were captured and beheaded, but the king, we are told, showed grace and favour to the ignorant and guiltless multitude. Sir Robert Welles, before dying, confessed that Warwick had been at the bottom of the rebellion, intending, if successful, to make Clarence king. The Battle of Eppingham had prevented Warwick from joining the insurgent army. The rebellion was quashed by King Edward's swift strategy. Recognizing that for the time at least the game was finished, Warwick and Clarence fled north, first to Chesterfield, then to Manchester, hoping to get assistance from the men of Lancashire. But Edward, going north too, followed in their tracks. They did not wait, but flying south again, they reached Exeter and then Dartmouth, where Warwick's influence with the seafaring people procured a few small ships to carry him and Clarence, with their respective households, to Calais. King Edward, as a matter of fact, did not pursue them far. He stopped at York to receive the homage of the gentlemen of the county, but he could not leave Warwick's brother as Earl of Northumberland. John Neville had not taken part either in Robin of Redesdale's rebellion or in that of Sir Robert Welles. On the other hand, he had done nothing and had been no help to the king. So on March 25th, Edward took from him the earldom of Northumberland and restored it to the Percys. As a consolation, he raised Neville a step in the peerage as Marquis Montague. Small consolation indeed for the loss of the ancient earldom of Northumberland, with its wealth and privileges. King Edward had thus won a great victory. He had triumphed in the field over his enemies. The great Kingmaker himself was a fugitive scouring the Channel, a pirate in the narrow seas. Yet, within 6 months, by another sudden turn of fortune's wheel, Edward himself was a fugitive abroad, and Warwick was once more king-making in England. Again the wheel of fortune turned, and another 6 months after saw Edward safely back in England, never more to go on his travels. The rest of Warwick's doings in 1470 are of a wonderful kind. He must have appeared off Calais toward the end of April. Edward, suspecting that this was his destination, had sent special orders warning Lord Wenlock, the lieutenant of the Tower, not to admit him. These orders Wenlock, though a friend of Warwick, did not care to disobey. Moreover, the merchants of Calais were bound to Burgundy by strong ties of commerce, and Charles of Burgundy let them know that he was supporting Edward. So Warwick was refused admittance to Calais, although he attempted to force an entry by bombarding the port. While his ships lay in the roadstead, his daughter, the Duchess of Clarence, who was present with her husband, was delivered of a son. It is said that Warwick's supplies were so reduced by this time that he had to beseech the lieutenant of Calais as a special concession to send 2 flagons of wine for the invalid duchess. Then Warwick sailed away toward Normandy, capturing all the Flemish and English merchantmen that he could find on the way, and throwing their crews into the sea. He landed at Harfleur on May 6th, where his men sold the booty they had taken from the merchantmen. Charles of Burgundy, by way of reprisal, seized all the French ships which came to the fair of Antwerp. The next 2 months brought one of the greatest diplomatic revolutions that have ever occurred in history. It was as if the Middle Ages were ending amid the destruction of all accepted ideas, to give place to a doctrine of opportunism. It is necessary for a prince wishing to hold his own to know how to do wrong. Footnote. Machiavelli, Prince, chapter 15. End footnote. Warwick, to maintain himself in this world, was willing to do what in all his past life he had held to be wrong. He was going to put down one of England's strongest kings and to restore her weakest. The other parties in this great diplomatic revolution, Queen Margaret and Louis of France, are much easier to justify. It must have been a terrible effort for Queen Margaret to consent to ally her cause with Warwick. It was he of all others who had worked most steadfastly to ruin her family. It was he who personally had led her husband, ignobly bound by thongs, to prison in the Tower of London. It was he who had cast doubts on the legitimacy of her son. Yet in accepting Warwick's help now, she broke no promises, she abandoned no friends. She felt that Warwick had fearfully wronged her, but now that he was ready to do her service, it was not for her to judge his motives, but to accept his help for what it was worth. Nor had Louis XI any reason to reject the Earl. It was the business of the King of France to protect his country. He had offered a peaceful alliance to King Edward, and his offer had been refused, not even courteously, but with scorn. The Anglo-Burgundian alliance was a serious danger to France, which was just winning its way to a stable condition after 100 years of turmoil. If Warwick could restore the Lancastrian friends of France, it was not for Louis to object. So under the skilful mediation of King Louis, the great alliance was gradually arranged. Queen Margaret and the Earl of Warwick made terms, and her last great assault was prepared against the Yorkist house. At this time Margaret was in France, urging Louis through her follower, the famous lawyer Fortescue, to lend her an expeditionary force against the Yorkists. The arrival of Warwick, with bitterness in his heart against King Edward, was too good a chance for her advisers to miss, and they worked hard to overcome her scruples. Louis XI, too, used all his influence. After 20 days of intricate negotiation and discussion at Angers, Margaret was at last induced to accept Warwick's help. She received the apologies of the Earl from his knees, and she allowed a contract of marriage to be made between her son, Prince Edward, and Anne, the younger daughter of Warwick. King Henry was to be restored to the throne of England. The Prince Edward and Princess Anne were to succeed him when he died. Only if their issue failed was the Duke of Clarence to succeed to the throne. This arrangement seemed to leave Clarence further from the crown than ever. But it is to be feared that his weakness was such that Warwick only looked upon him as a convenient but not very reliable tool. Once the alliance of Warwick and Margaret was concluded, no time was lost in preparing a strong expedition. Meanwhile, King Edward was following his usual practice, when danger was not actually present, of leaving things alone. Charles of Burgundy, who had no desire to lose the important friendship of England, sent him continual warnings that tremendous danger was threatening from the side of Warwick. Edward indeed did something, but not enough. He sent out a fleet under Anthony Rivers, Lord Scales, to patrol the Channel, but it seems not to have kept the sea long enough. Charles of Burgundy did more. He had a fleet which regularly blockaded the Seine and prevented Warwick's expedition from moving. but a September gale forced the Burgundian fleet to abandon its watch for a time, and so cleared a passage for Warwick. Queen Margaret and her household remained in France to await the event. The Earl, with a force of which the numbers are not known, crossed the Channel on or about September 8th, 1470, and effected a landing in Devonshire at Dartmouth. The people of the county showed goodwill. Soon quite a large force was gathered around the Earl. Edward, in spite of the warnings of Charles of Burgundy, was taken by surprise. He was in Yorkshire, with a force to deal with a small insurrection which no doubt had been arranged for the purpose of drawing him thither. When he heard of the landing of Warwick, and of the lack of any opposition to the Earl, he came to the conclusion that his only chance was flight. If he had had a good force, he would doubtless have made a stand. There was no cowardice in King Edward. But the levies of the north were not with him. Warwick's brother, the Marquis Montague, was at this time staying at Pontefract. He now requited the clemency and confidence with which Edward had honoured him, by forming a conspiracy to kidnap the king as he was lying at Doncaster. Montague was a man of great power in the north. Edward, when he heard of this plot through a spy, realized that his condition was perilous. He made all speed to King's Lynn in Norfolk, where a small ship of his own and 2 Flemish vessels were lying. Getting on board on October 3rd without baggage or money, he set sail for the territories of his Burgundian brother-in-law. The extraordinary suddenness with which Edward lost his kingdom surprised contemporary observers. The monkish chronicler of Croyland explains it by referring to the apathy of the people of England. When Warwick and his men landed in Devonshire, the people showed this attitude, not so much joining them as waiting upon them to show them every attention. The country by this time seemed to have lost interest in the Wars of the Roses, and to be content to accept anyone who was strong enough to take the kingdom from his opponent. The shrewd Burgundian official, Philippe de Comines, explains the flight of Edward in another way. It was very surprising to see this poor king run away in this manner and be pursued by his own subjects. He had indulged himself in ease and pleasures for 12 or 13 years together, and enjoyed a larger share of them than any other prince of the time. It seems true that Edward had been self-indulgent and careless. He showed great energy and boldness when a crisis was actually present, but in the periods of comparative quiet between each crisis he was neither prudent nor careful. At the present juncture, with the stout body of 800 men or more who stood by him, he might have made a good fight, but he would almost certainly have lost his realm and his life. His flight was certainly not due to a lack of courage. It only showed that he realized at last the need of prudence. A kingdom as easily lost might be as easily re-won. By the time he regained it, Edward had learnt his lesson. There was no chance of the crown slipping from him again. He was fortunate to obtain a fair passage to Holland, although his ship was chased by some Easterlings, men of the Hanseatic League, who at this time were on bad terms with the English. He dropped anchor just off the little port of Alkmaar in Friesland. There Louis de Bruges, Seigneur de la Ruthuse, who was governor for the Duke of Burgundy in Holland, came to him and showed every kindness. Edward was so poorly furnished with money at the time of his flight that he had only been able to pay the master of the ship that carried him with a gown lined with marten skins. By the Seigneur de la Ruthuse, Edward and his friends were brought to the Hague, and news of their arrival was sent to the Duke of Burgundy. Meanwhile 11 days had sufficed for Warwick to gain England for King Henry, the prisoner in the Tower. The flight of Edward was a public acknowledgment that the kingdom was at the disposal of the Earl. Moreover, Warwick's following, after he had been a short time in the country, seems to have grown very large. The Lancastrian gentry would of course flock to him, as he represented Queen Margaret and meant to restore Henry VI. The many neutral people too, and they seemed typical of the mass of Englishmen then, would come to him, wishing to stand well with the new government. But Edward, when he fled from the country, left many friends behind him. These he advised at the time, through his faithful chamberlain, Lord Hastings, to submit to the Earl of Warwick and to wait for better times. They took the advice and quietly waited for Edward's return. This explains the transitory character of the Lancastrian Restoration. It explains, too, the essential stability of King Edward's position. The Londoners were known to be his friends, and London was the heart of England. But for a time all went well with Warwick. The Londoners made no resistance, and the newcomers on October 6th were able to enter the city and occupy the chief places. The Earl's first act was to go to the Tower to restore King Henry to the throne. Since his imprisonment there in 1465, Henry had been well treated. He saw his friends occasionally, and he bore his captivity with complete equanimity. Warwick, when he had led Henry to the Tower in 1465, had cried, "Treason, treason, and behold the traitor." But now he proclaimed him king, attended him to his palace in Westminster, and restored to him his royal prerogative. On October 13th, 1470, a solemn procession was held, and in St. Paul's the crown was publicly placed on King Henry's head, the poor king remaining subdued and silent like a crowned calf. All laws were once more enacted in the name of King Henry, and all writs and patents were dated in the 48th year of his reign. But there was no great joy at the Restoration, more especially as the Kentish men who came to London with Warwick took the opportunity to plunder where they could the houses of the citizens. End of section 25. Section 26 of The Wars of the Roses by Robert Balmain Mowat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 19. The Last of the Lancastrians, Part 1. Queen Margaret and her son did not follow the successful expedition. Throughout the brief period of Lancastrian restoration, October 1470 to April 1471, they remained in France, mainly, as it seems, at the court of Louis XI. Undoubtedly, this was a mistake, as the presence of the young Prince Edward of Wales would have done something to rouse the sentiment for the Lancastrian family, which the appearance of the now apathetic King Henry failed to evoke. Queen Margaret had not seen her husband since she left him in Bamborough Castle in August 1463. It is strange that she did not now take the opportunity afforded by his restoration to come over to England and see him. Poor Henry himself sent to France for his wife and son in February 1471, but still they did not come. If Margaret was waiting for Warwick to establish the Lancastrian government on a firm basis, she was waiting in vain. Boldness and confidence were essential to the safety of the restored dynasty. The absence of queen and prince showed how much that essential boldness and confidence were lacking. It may be that Margaret, as a Frenchwoman, did not understand the English nation. The new government did what it could to get the machinery of administration into working order. Warwick had the position of lieutenant of the kingdom. New money was struck, with the head of Henry on one side and an image of St. Michael on the other. These coins were called angels. A parliament was summoned to meet on November 26th. The new government showed itself merciful, seeing that everybody quietly accepted the new regime. Only the Constable of England was executed. John Tiptoft, Earl of Worcester, that horrid butcher and savage beheader of men. He had been captured hiding near Weybridge, knowing that he could expect no mercy. His death took place on October 18th, 1470. On November 26th, Parliament met. Archbishop Neville, Warwick's brother, was again Chancellor, and preaching the opening sermon from the text, "Turn, O backsliding children." In the event of the House of Lancaster becoming extinct, the reversion of the crown was settled upon Clarence. The attainders formerly passed against Henry's supporters were reversed, and thus prominent exiles like the Duke of Somerset were able to come back to England. The Parliament sat till Christmas. So ended the year 1470. Nothing seems to have happened to disturb the peace of the new government until March 1471. Early in that month it became known that King Edward was likely at any moment to make a descent upon the east coast. Since his hurried exit from England on October 3rd, 1470, Edward had been vigorously preparing for his return. At first, things had not gone well for him. The Duke of Burgundy, who was at Boulogne when he first heard of Edward's disaster — it was reported as the king's death — received the news with equanimity, for his personal tastes lay more towards Lancaster than York. When he heard that Edward was alive and in Flanders, he was a little troubled. He sent Philippe de Comines to Calais to inquire after the disposition of the garrison there. De Comines reported that on receiving the news of Edward's flight from England, within a quarter of an hour the whole town had assumed the ragged staff, the livery of the Earl of Warwick. So great was the instability of human affairs. Worse was to follow, for de Comines learned that Warwick, according to the terms of his alliance with Louis XI, intended to send 4,000 men over to Calais to make war on Burgundy. From this, however, he was dissuaded by the remonstrances of the merchants of the staple, who feared to lose the great market for their wool which was in Flanders. Edward did not meet Duke Charles till the beginning of 1471. In the meantime, he must have relied chiefly on the hospitality of the Seigneur de la Haute-Ruse. When fortune later smiled on him, Edward was able handsomely to repay this kindness. But in January 1471 two meetings were arranged between Edward and Charles. The important conference was at St. Paul on January 7th. Charles, who feared the consequences for his duchy of the union of the Earl of Warwick and Louis XI against him, was loath to give open support to the Yorkist cause. But at last, while publicly pretending to give no assistance and issuing a proclamation against any of his subjects taking part, he agreed to lend Edward 50,000 florins and 3 or 4 great ships of his own, besides hiring a number of Hanseatic ships well armed to convey Edward's force to England. Next month, February, Edward seems to have passed at Bruges, where he was well received by the Flemish nobility and greatly helped in his plans for invading England. On March 2nd, his force embarked at Flushing. He had in all 1,200 men, mainly English, but partly Flemish auxiliaries. Chief among his followers were his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, his brother-in-law Anthony, Earl Rivers, and his chamberlain, Lord Hastings. Contrary winds prevented the ships making the passage to England until March 11th. During all this time Edward kept the men on board ship, ready to sail. But on the 11th the expedition sailed for the coast of Norfolk, arriving off Cromer on Tuesday, March 12th. Finding through inquiries made by some of his men on shore that the people of East Anglia favoured the Earl of Warwick, Edward sailed further north, and in spite of a severe tempest, landed on the 14th of March in the shelter of Spurnhead, near the site of the little port of Ravenspur. Ever since Henry of Bolingbroke landed there in 1399, the sea had been gradually encroaching, and by 1471 there was probably little of Ravenspur left. Today it has disappeared. On the next day, Edward, having collected his men, for they had not all landed at the same spot, pushed forward to York, proclaiming, like another Henry of Bolingbroke, that he only came to claim his inheritance as Duke of York. So they proceeded in a north-easterly direction by Hull and Beverley, without opposition, to York, the capital of the north, March 18th. Here King Edward and his host were refused admittance. But on the king consenting to bring only 15 men-at-arms, leaving the rest of his force outside, it was agreed to admit him. The citizens seem by no means to have all favoured his party. Edward, however, whose courage was of the highest, did not fear to enter almost alone. He was greeted by a multitude of citizens crying, "Long live King Henry!" but On Edward's appealing to them as Duke of York, they responded to him by crying at last, "Long live the noble Duke of York." His confidence and courage were rewarded. Even the rest of his forces were now admitted, to receive much needed refreshment and rest, on condition that they should depart next morning. Next morning King Edward and his men, avoiding all chance of a riot with the citizens, left York and took the road for Tadcaster. From there he followed the more westerly road to Wakefield, so avoiding Pontefract, which was held by Warwick's brother, the Marquis Montague. That Edward was able to march so far unopposed was largely due to the fact that the safeguarding of the north for King Henry was entrusted to two different men: to Warwick's brother, the Marquis Montague, formerly Earl of Northumberland, and to Henry Percy, whom in 1470 Edward had restored to the earldom of Northumberland when he deprived Montague of it. Between Montague and Percy there could be no cordiality. Percy purposely did not oppose Edward's march, and so rendered him great service. Montague alone was too weak to oppose the king. From Wakefield, which was part of the domain of the Duke of York, Edward advanced to Doncaster and to Nottingham. At Nottingham he is said to have received his first considerable accession, 600 well-armed men under 2 local knights. Here, too, he received his first definite news of the plans of his enemy. His spies informed him that the Duke of Exeter and the Earl of Oxford were behind him at Newark, 18 miles north-east of Nottingham, with 4,000 men of East Anglia. But Edward had no need to turn back to deal with them. When they heard that he was likely to come, they hastily evacuated Newark. Edward, on learning that the men of East Anglia were no longer dangerous, immediately continued his advance, hoping to have a decisive conflict with the Earl of Warwick, who had left London and come into Warwickshire, there to gather all his men for dealing with the invader. Edward marched through Leicestershire, where he received an accession of 3,000 men. Warwick, avoiding a battle, retired into Coventry with about 7,000 men. Edward arrived in front of the town on March 30th. His forces are said to have been slightly inferior to those of Warwick. Nevertheless, the Earl refused his offer of battle and kept within the walls. It is possible that he was waiting for reinforcements to come from his brother Montague, from the East Anglian men under the Duke of Exeter, and perhaps also from the Duke of Clarence. Nevertheless, his refusal to meet King Edward's army was a mistake, for the king, leaving Coventry behind, went on at once and occupied the town of Warwick. Thus he lay between the Earl's forces and London. The balance of power at this moment lay with Clarence, who had 4,000 men raised in Gloucestershire and Wiltshire. The Duke had soon sickened of his position in the restored Lancastrian court. Warwick's acknowledgment of King Henry and Prince Edward of Wales cut him off more than ever from the crown. The old Lancastrian nobles did not conceal their contempt for him. While Edward was in Flanders, great efforts had been made by his sister, the Duchess of Burgundy, through various messengers, to reconcile the two brothers. Clarence soon made up his mind to support Edward again, and to use his levies in his brother's service. While Edward was at the town of Warwick, he heard that Clarence was coming to him. Some inkling of this may account for the Earl of Warwick's hesitation in Coventry. But the Earl would have been well advised to attack the king separately before the approach of Clarence. For Edward, when he heard of Clarence's approach, at once set out and met his brother at Banbury. Thence the united forces returned to the town of Warwick. Some futile negotiations took place with the Earl in Coventry. These failed, and Edward again offered battle under the walls of that town on April 5th. But again failing to draw the Earl, he resolved to go straight on to London, from which he must have had good intelligence that the citizens would receive him without difficulty. On Palm Sunday, April 7th, he attended service in the great church at Daventry, and is said to have received an intimation from St. Anne that his campaign would be successful. From Daventry, Edward went on to Dunstable, and was able to send comfortable news to his queen, who since his departure for Flanders had been in sanctuary at Westminster. Thence he pushed forward to London, and entered the city on April 11th. He was loyally received by the mayor, aldermen, and burgesses, and by the Archbishop of York, Warwick's brother, who, seeing the hopelessness of attempting to hold London, had made terms with King Edward. End of section 26. Section 27 of The Wars of the Roses by Robert Balmain Mowat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 19. The Last of the Lancastrians, Part 2. If Edward had been refused admittance into London, he would have been in an extremely perilous situation, liable to be crushed between the Earl of Warwick in his rear and the Londoners in front. An attempt had been made on April 9th, 2 days before his arrival at the city, to rouse the Lancastrian party there. The Archbishop of York had held a council at St. Paul's. King Henry, who had all the time of Edward's march remained in London, mounted on a horse, and showed himself at the head of 600 supporters. But this was not sufficient display of force to win over the Londoners. Philippe de Comines later made inquiries into the causes of Edward's good reception into the city, and learnt that there were three. Firstly, the presence of many Yorkists who had stayed in sanctuary throughout the restoration of King Henry, and especially the presence of a son and heir to King Edward, born in Westminster Sanctuary on November 3rd of the previous year, 1470. The second cause was the great debts which King Edward owed in the city, which obliged the tradesmen who hoped to be repaid to support his restoration. The third cause was that the citizens' wives, with whom he had formerly been familiar, forced their husbands and relatives to declare themselves on his side. So King Edward entered London, and the unfortunate King Henry was once again a prisoner. On April 12th, Good Friday, a council was held to consider the situation. Next day, the 13th, Edward marched out again with his men, and King Henry with him, to meet Warwick. For the Earl, now reinforced by Montague and men from the north, and by the Duke of Exeter and the Earl of Oxford with their East Anglian contingent, was coming steadily toward London to risk everything upon a battle. King Edward, with his usual energy whenever a fight was in prospect, marched up the Great North Road. Some of Warwick's men had already entered Barnet, but Edward's advance guard drove them back to their main body, which was about 1.5 miles north. The Yorkist main body came up to the town as night was approaching, but Edward, foreseeing the danger if his army were caught next morning by Warwick among the narrow streets, refused to spend the night there, and gave orders that his men should go through the town and take up their position for the night outside near Warwick's host. The Earl was evidently surprised by this move, and owing to the darkness of the evening, did not precisely understand the Yorkist position. He ordered his artillery, which always formed an important part of his armies, to fire all night into the Yorkist host. But the shots passed over the enemy's heads. In the darkness, Warwick's gunners mistook the range, as the Yorkists were really nearer than was supposed. King Edward's artillery did not reply, and his men were instructed to light no fires and make no noise. Next morning, Easter Sunday, April 14th, 1471, between 5 and 6 o'clock, Edward arrayed his army for battle, in spite of the great fog which was over all. Warwick's forces are said to have been much superior to Edward's. Each army was apparently drawn up in 3 battles, a right, a centre, and a left. The opposing lines, though extending about the same length, were not exactly opposite each other. The Lancastrian right overlapped the Yorkist left, and the Yorkist right overlapped the Lancastrian left. This is an old and well-known weakness to which all ancient and medieval armies were subject when they advanced to a hand-to-hand combat. Each man instinctively pressed toward the right, and so the opposing lines seldom met exactly, but one overlapped the other at each end. This tendency is noticed and explained by Thucydides in his account of the Battle of Mantinea in 418 BC. In this way, the Lancastrian right enveloped and broke the Yorkist left, and fugitives carried the report of a defeat to London. But King Edward, who always fought on foot, led his men against the centre where Warwick was, himself striking down everyone who opposed him. His brothers Gloucester and Clarence on the right did good service too, and managed to envelop and break the opposing Lancastrians. Meanwhile, the victorious Lancastrian right had taken to plundering and so lost the fruits of its success. But the Yorkist right was sufficiently kept in hand to wheel round so as to take the Warwick centre in the rear. 4 hours' hard fighting brought the conflict to an end. The losses on each side were heavy, especially on the Lancastrian side, where Warwick, Montague, and the Duke of Exeter were all 3 dead. In this battle both sides fought upon foot. On Edward's part this was his invariable custom. Warwick, on the other hand, as a rule began the battle by leading his men to the charge on foot himself. This done, he would mount one of his horses and hold himself and his squires in reserve, either to charge boldly at the decisive moment or to save themselves in case of defeat. But on this occasion he was advised by his brother, the Marquis Montague, who was a man of great personal courage, to fight on foot along with the rest of his army. Thus it was that Warwick, when his men gave way, was delayed in getting to his horses, and so was overtaken and slain in a wood near by. King Edward is said to have expressed regret for his death. In this battle the order to kill the gentry and spare the commons was not given, for King Edward was much angered at the way in which the common people had abandoned his cause and favoured the Earl of Warwick at the time of the flight to Burgundy in October 1470. So now he had resolved to call out no more to spare the common soldiers. The number slain is, as usual, variously stated. Sir John Paston, who fought on Warwick's side, says that there were slain of both parties together more than 1,000. Other estimates give a total of 4,000, but Sir John Paston is not likely to have underestimated the numbers slain. Edward permitted honourable burial to his dead opponents. The bodies of Warwick and Montague were exposed for 2 days at St. Paul's to convince the common people that they were dead. Then they were buried in the family resting place of the Earls of Salisbury in Bisham Abbey on the Thames near Marlow. In the weeks preceding the Battle of Barnet, Queen Margaret had been getting together a considerable force to come at last to England for the support of her husband and the Earl of Warwick. At the same time, Edmund, Duke of Somerset, one of the most devoted of the Lancastrians, left London for the West Country to raise a force with which he might join Margaret when she landed. He had succeeded in raising a fair-sized body in the West about the time of the Battle of Barnet. Queen Margaret assembled her men at Harfleur on March 24th. She had with her the Prince Edward, her son, the Countess of Warwick, Lord Wenlock, and a number of Lancastrian knights. High seas, it is said, kept her ships, mainly supplied in all probability by Louis XI, weather-bound till April 13th. But it is possible that she was still hesitating, waiting to hear if King Edward was defeated, or till the West should have risen to support her. On Easter Day, April 14th, when the Battle of Barnet was fought, she landed at Weymouth, a convenient port from which to join the Duke of Somerset, who was raising the men of Dorsetshire. From Weymouth, Margaret, who cannot have had more than a few hundred men in all, went to the Benedictine Abbey of Cerne, 7 miles north of Dorchester. There she was met by Edmund, Duke of Somerset, and Thomas Courtenay, Earl of Devon, with a good number of people. they brought her the terrible news of Edward's success at Barnet. But the situation was not considered hopeless, for though Warwick was dead and King Henry a prisoner, the Lancastrians were in arms in great numbers in Dorsetshire, in Wales under Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, and in the north. Also on the sea, the bastard of Fauconberg had a Lancastrian fleet, and was threatening a descent upon London. The Queen, on the advice of her friends, moved on with all her forces to Exeter, for her cause was always strong in the west. End of section 27. Section 28 of The Wars of the Roses by Robert Balmain Mowat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 19, The Last of the Lancastrians, Part 3. Edward heard of her landing on April 16th when he was at London. He had to allow some days for the resting and refreshing of his men who had fought at Barnet, and for the raising of new forces in the friendly home counties. Meanwhile, he himself went down to Windsor Castle and celebrated St. George's Day, April 23rd. Then he set out to find Queen Margaret's army, which his spies informed him was in the region of Cornwall, and marching toward the northwest. For Queen Margaret and her force had left Exeter and taken the direct road to Glastonbury, and from there to Bath. As she went along, she gathered more armed men to her standard. It was her object to get into the Severn Valley, for although the Yorkist family had large estates and great influence in the central district of the Welsh March around Ludlow, yet on the whole the rest of the March country seems to have favoured the Lancastrians. Margaret might find support there and be able to join forces with Jasper Tudor. So King Edward planned to meet her and offer battle by the Severn about Gloucester and Tewkesbury, where, for an army coming from the direction of Bath, is the gate of Wales. King Edward, marching through the country on the north side of the Thames, reached Cirencester on April 29th, at the time when Queen Margaret was approaching Bath. He believed from what his scouts told him that Margaret was coming up to offer battle, but instead she marched to Bristol, where she received a good welcome and reinforcement in men, money, and especially artillery. On May 2nd, Margaret sent some mounted men to Sudbury to inspect and occupy a field for battle with King Edward. But when Edward, whose scouts or spies brought him this information, marched up in his best order to Sudbury, he found no enemy there. Queen Margaret's force had slipped past and was marching post-haste for Gloucester. This was the critical moment of the campaign. If Margaret got over the Severn at Gloucester, she would have been able to join with Jasper Tudor and to raise the whole of Wales in arms, and so to go on to Lancashire. But King Edward selected one of his officers, Richard Beauchamp, son of Lord Beauchamp, and sent him on with a company of men-at-arms to occupy Gloucester and hold it against Margaret for the few hours necessary to enable him to bring up his army. Beauchamp moved quicker than the larger body of troops with Margaret, and reached Gloucester in time to put it into a state of defence against the attack of the Lancastrians. Some of the citizens seem to have favoured the Lancastrians, so that the arrival of Beauchamp was very timely for the cause of King Edward. Margaret and her forces came up at 10 in the morning, May 3rd, 1471, after a forced march, and found they were too late. With Edward's force on their heels, they did not dare to deliver an assault on the town. There was no course open to them but to push on as quickly as they could till they could find some means of crossing the Severn. They had already been marching all night, and it took them till nearly 5 p.m. to reach Tewkesbury, which was only 10 miles further on. There was no bridge here, the army was dead tired and had lost its compactness. Many men had fallen out of the ranks and become for the time mere stragglers. Edward's army, well equipped and well led, was not far off now. So Margaret was compelled to stop and give battle. She had still time to choose a good position and to face the enemy without the panic that might arise from a further flight. Edward had been marching apparently in a course parallel to that of the Lancastrians. We are told he came by open country, Champagne, on the slopes of the Cotswolds to a village called Cheltenham, where he received definite news that the Lancastrians were at Tewkesbury. His force was all ready for the fight, being arranged in the usual 3 battles, with an adequate number of mounted scouts in advance and on both sides. With his customary energy, he refused to allow his men to rest in the pleasant village of Cheltenham, but pushed on towards Tewkesbury. When his army had proceeded 5 miles out of the 8 that separated them from the Lancastrians, the evening had closed in, and it became necessary to halt for the night. This respite must have been welcome to both sides, especially to the weary Lancastrians, for these must have realized how impossible it was to shake off the determined pursuit of King Edward. Next day, Saturday, May 4th, 1471, as it dawned bright and clear, Edward had his trumpets sounded and drew up his forces in battle and advanced to the Lancastrian position. Queen Margaret and Prince Edward seem to have relied for their dispositions on the advice of Edmund, Duke of Somerset. The position was skilfully chosen, 1 mile outside the town of Tewkesbury. They occupied elevated ground in an angle formed by the Swillgate Brook and the river Avon. Behind was the abbey and town of Tewkesbury. The ground in front of them was broken up by hedges, bushes, and ditches, a common feature in the Severn Valley. Somerset commanded the right, Prince Edward had the central battle, and the Earl of Devon had the left. In 3 battles also the Yorkists made their advance. Edward led the centre, Gloucester had the right, and Hastings the left, which was held in reserve. The attack must have taken place early in the day. The Yorkist army was very well led. Each division could be counted on to do its duty. King Edward on foot in the centre was a host in himself. His brother Gloucester could always be relied on to do a useful piece of work on the right. He was a careful and also brilliant and determined leader, who never did anything to disturb the general plan of operations. Lord Hastings on the left was not brilliant, but he had solid qualities which were very useful to the king. He was content to face and hold the enemy's right, while Edward and the dashing Gloucester broke the opposite centre and left. As the Yorkist force advanced, their artillerymen and archers sent deadly shots among the enemy, who replied with their artillery and archers also. Had the Lancastrians remained in their position, it would have been very difficult for the Yorkists to come to close quarters with them. But Edmund, Duke of Somerset, who commanded the Lancastrian right, judged it better to lead his knights and men-at-arms in a charge against the advancing enemy, rather than to stand still and suffer from the Yorkist missiles. So he took a strong body of his men out of the park where they had their station, into a deep lane which led forward toward the left flank of the Yorkist centre. Thus he was able to approach quite close to the enemy without being perceived. Then suddenly, issuing from the lane, he boldly charged at the head of his men on to the surprised Yorkists. But King Edward, though surprised, was not off his guard. Facing the charge and fighting as he always did on foot at the head of his men, he steadied his ranks and received the attack of Somerset with great firmness, so that he not merely met and checked the charge, but actually drove them back toward the lines they had just left. At this critical moment, Somerset found himself suddenly charged from the outer side by a force of 200 picked lances, whom Edward had previously detached to occupy a small wood below and to the west side of Somerset's lines. This new assailant on one side, combined with Edward's determined attack on the other, was too much for Somerset's knights to bear. They gave way, and King Edward's men were able to advance into the park or enclosure of the Lancastrian right wing, making great slaughter as they went. Having broken the enemy's right, or vaward, Edward turned his men against the Lancastrian centre, where under Prince Edward the main body made a desperate fight. But the battle was soon over. The break-up of their right had exposed their centre to a deadly turning movement. Before long the whole army was broken and scattered in hopeless rout. The losses on the side of the Lancastrians were extremely heavy. Their position, though good for defence, gave small means of retreat. The Duke of Somerset fled for sanctuary to Tewkesbury Abbey. It is said that when driven, after his disastrous charge, back to the Lancastrian centre, with his own axe he broke the head of Lord Wenlock, and then turned his horse from the field. Lord Wenlock, under Prince Edward, was in command of the centre. He had not supported the charge of Somerset, but had merely kept his position. The Duke ascribed this inaction to treason, yet there is much to be said in its favour. It was Somerset's charge that sacrificed all the advantages of a good position. Prince Edward, who is said to have been a handsome youth, now aged 17½ years, was slain as he tried to leave the battlefield, crying on the Duke of Clarence, his brother-in-law, for help. The Earl of Devon fell fighting, as did also Somerset's brother John. The Duke of Somerset was taken out of sanctuary in the Abbey and beheaded for treason 2 days after the battle, Monday, May 6th. Thus all the legitimate heirs of the House of Beaufort were extinguished, but a representative of John Beaufort remained, the Lady Margaret, who had married Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Their son, Henry Tudor, was at the time of the Battle of Tewkesbury in Wales with his uncle Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, raising the country for Queen Margaret. Toward the rest of the Lancastrian army King Edward showed clemency. Although the sanctuary of the Abbey could not legally protect them from the consequences of treason, yet their lives were spared. The bodies of Prince Edward and the other noble dead were buried with due obsequies in the Abbey. Queen Margaret, who was found at a convent not far from the battlefield, was taken prisoner to be brought to London to appear before the king's triumphal car. England was thus re-won for King Edward, although not yet entirely subdued. There still remained 3 troubled regions. Jasper Tudor, Earl of Pembroke, and his nephew, Henry Tudor, were in arms in South Wales. There was a rising in Yorkshire. London itself was being menaced, though Edward himself did not know this, by the bastard of Fauconberg, an illegitimate son of the Earl of Kent, who had crossed the Channel with men from the garrison of Calais, and landed at Sandwich at about the time of the Battle of Tewkesbury. But these obstacles to King Edward melted away one after the other. From Tewkesbury he pushed northwards to Coventry, where he arrived on May 11th. There he received news that the rebellion in the north had collapsed, largely owing to the efforts made in his behalf by Henry Percy, the restored Earl of Northumberland. At Coventry, Edward rested his army for 3 clear days. On receipt of news from London announcing the razing of Kent by the bastard of Fauconberg, he led his army back to meet this new danger. But ere he arrived at London, all was practically over. Fauconberg, with many of the men of Kent, had arrived at the south side of the river on May 11th, and demanded the release of King Henry from the Tower. But the men of the city and the garrison of the Tower, under Edward's brother-in-law Anthony, Lord Rivers, foiled the bold attempt of the bastard, who, after doing considerable damage to the houses on London Bridge, and plundering all the suburbs on the south of the river, was compelled to fall back to Sandwich. By this time the army of King Edward was quite close. He entered London with great state and splendour on May 21st, with the captive Queen Margaret in his train. Footnote: Queen Margaret was kept in England till 1476, when she was allowed to retire to France. End footnote. His own queen and their son, who throughout the campaign of Tewkesbury had been living under the guardianship of Lord Rivers in the Tower of London, were ready to welcome him. They had just escaped a serious danger. Had the bastard of Fauconberg succeeded in his boldly conceived and well executed plan, as he might have done, for the temper of the citizens was always uncertain, he would have gained the person of King Edward's wife, son, and heir, and also of the old legitimate king, Henry VI. As things turned out, the bastard's attempt was a complete failure. On May 23rd, King Edward followed him to Sandwich, and there accepted his surrender. He was put in charge of the Duke of Gloucester, but in September, after attempting to escape, he was beheaded. The two Tudors, Jasper, Earl of Pembroke, and his nephew Henry, were still in Pembroke, refusing to recognise the Yorkist king. They would not yield, neither could they by themselves uphold the Lancastrian power. They remained in South Wales for another 3 months, probably in hiding. In September they gave up their hopeless enterprise and sailed away to Brittany. Long before this, the sorrowful King Henry had breathed his last. He seems to have died on the same day as King Edward entered London, May 21st. One account says that, hearing of the disaster at Tewkesbury, he died of pure displeasure and melancholy, but many people believed he was murdered. Later writers point to the Duke of Gloucester as instrumental in his death. With King Henry, the legitimate Lancastrian line became extinct. End of section 28. Section 29 of The Wars of the Roses by Robert Balmain Mowat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 20. English Society during the Wars of the Roses, Part 1. From the year 1450 to 1471, from the rising of Jack Cade to the death of Henry VI, a condition of war with a few intervals of peace had been existing in England. This war, which began in protests against the Lancastrian government, ended in a long conflict between two rival houses, Lancaster and York, for the crown. The name Wars of the Roses is an invention of the 16th century. The White Rose of York alone was used as a badge during the actual period of the warfare. Nevertheless, the name is a good one and explains the character of the period. This public and sanguinary struggle between two aristocratic factions could hardly have occurred, and certainly could never have continued so long, in a settled and well-ordered society. But England had seldom been without some serious disturbances since the accession of the Lancastrian house in 1399. The struggle between York and Lancaster seems scarcely more than a grand and critical instance of the working of causes everywhere potent for harm. A list of riots, feuds, and private wars can without much difficulty be made up to cover the years from 1399 to 1471. Such a condition of society could only exist owing to the lack of a strong hand in justice and police. The government was not equal to its fundamental duty of keeping order. But the weakness of the Lancastrian government is itself difficult to explain. For some reason, the dynasty did not have the confidence of the governing classes of that time, of the nobles and country gentlemen. Yet the Lancastrians were an honourable house, English and of the old royal family, anxious to govern acceptably, careful to observe the constitution and to maintain the liberties and privileges of their subjects. But their constitutionalism must not be exaggerated. The Lancastrian experiment was not a medieval anticipation of the limited monarchy of today. Henry VI, when his period of minority was over, exercised much the same constitutional powers as Edward III. He chose his own ministers against the known wishes of Parliament. The truth, perhaps, is not that constitutional progress had outrun administrative order, for the constitution was not too advanced for the needs of the age. In one respect at least, in the county franchise, the Lancastrians restricted it. Their weakness has some other cause than their love of freedom. Undoubtedly during the 15th century there was a feeling of lawlessness among the upper classes. This is amply proved by the private wars which families fought with each other, and by the difficulty which was found in every county of enforcing the statutes against livery and maintenance. The country seems to have got into the same condition which William of Newburgh describes 3 centuries earlier in the reign of Stephen, when there were in England as many kings, or rather tyrants, as there were lords of castles. This lawlessness among the upper classes was probably a reaction from the 100 Years' War, the long intermittent conflict on French soil. After the great days of King Henry V, the English fortunes in France slowly declined. Troops of men, nobles, mercenary captains, common soldiers came back into England, demoralized by long years of bitter warfare, of fighting for their lives and their booty amid an alien people. War was their only occupation. In time of peace they were out of place. For law they can have had little respect, and the renewal of fighting was their main chance of success. The fathers and relations of these persons had plundered and destroyed the greatest part of France, and possessed it for several years, and afterwards they turned their swords upon themselves and killed one another. Thus the 100 Years' War reacted upon England, but fortunately it did not bring with it all the same train of misery. France, it is well known, suffered fearfully in the last stages of the 100 Years' War. The towns within or near the sphere of operations declined. Commerce was seriously diminished. In some places, whole trades disappeared. In the country district, the conditions of life were terrible. Atrocious misery, perpetual insecurity, famine, depopulation, emigration. The forest, the brushwood, the desert had reconquered France. 10 years after the war had ended, Louis XI, travelling from Flanders to Paris, saw, as he said, only ruins, barren and uncultivated fields, a sort of desert. But England fared more happily. She had no foreign enemy on her soil, and the civil tumults, disastrous as they were, did not for a moment set back the solid progress of her people. The population seems not to have declined, nor was the wealth of the country in any way exhausted. With the end of public and private warfare in 1471, the normal life of the people as a whole, which had never been seriously interrupted, went on apace. The barons were a small class, and even small losses in a few battles seriously diminished their number and power. But the commons were the bulk of England, a perpetual corporation, in no wise essentially affected by personal or party changes. Yet it is easy to exaggerate the stability of English life during the Wars of the Roses. The general tranquillity of the country at large, while feudalism was dashing itself to pieces in battle after battle, was shown by the remarkable fact that justice remained wholly undisturbed. The law courts sat quietly at Westminster, the judges rode as of old in circuit, the system of jury trial took more and more its modern form. These statements should not be taken literally. Things do not go on in times of civil war just as in times of peace. The Paston Letters alone provide overwhelming evidence of the breakdown of the judicial system and of illegal acts in the county of Norfolk. There is plenty of evidence of a similar state of affairs in Devon, in Yorkshire, and elsewhere. The administration of government had broken down, yet the old habits went on and society adjusted itself to the prevailing conditions. There was a lack of governance, but not anarchy. Such is the conclusion that may be come to after a survey of the different ranks and classes during the period. The rural classes in the 15th century continued the development which had set in after the peasants' revolt of 1381. Looked at broadly, the results of this revolt were twofold. The lords of manors, finding it impossible to compel the villeins to give labour services as rent, ceased to cultivate their demesnes or home farms. The villeins were allowed to keep their holdings by paying money rents. Each tenant was given a copy of the conditions of his tenancy as registered in the court rolls of the manor. Thus arose the system of copyhold tenure, by which a tenant obtained a lease of his holding for a certain period, frequently for 3 lives. About the same time the lord in many cases turned his cultivated demesne into pasture, on which a few shepherds reared sheep. Thus the granting of copyholds and the enclosing of demesne land for pasturage were 2 great movements which went on after the peasants' revolt. Enclosures were more or less frequently made of tenant holdings also when the leases had expired. Throughout the greater part of the 15th century the country people as a whole were in a fairly prosperous condition. The villeins and freeholders were generally left in peaceable possession of their holdings. The great lawyer Littleton, writing in 1475, stated that although many of these people were only tenants at will, yet by the custom of the manor they had a very substantial hold upon their farms. The lord cannot break the custom which is reasonable in these cases. Villenage as a status was almost extinct. Many of the villeins had become copyholders, and are indistinguishable from the general body of free yeomen. Enclosures had made very little progress before 1470. The lord, as has been already noticed, often turned his demesne land into pasturage, but this harmed nobody. Enclosures of common lands or copyholds by the lords of manors were rare. The great period of such enclosures was roughly from 1470 to 1600. This was largely due to the break-up of feudal tenures and the exploitation of nobles' estates on an economic basis. All evidence of the time points to a fair amount of prosperity among the rural classes in this century during the Wars of the Roses. The armies of the time were small, seldom numbering more than 5,000 men. They remained on foot only for a few weeks at a time, dispersing shortly after the conclusion of each important battle. The armies consisted mainly of the retainers of noble lords and a number of knights and squires. The people as a whole took no part in the fights, but they really held the balance of power. Therefore neither Yorkist nor Lancastrian party dared allow much plundering by their army, as unpopularity among the people would instantly ruin their cause. The very apathy of the people, so much noticed by Philippe de Comines, proves that the war caused little distress. If it had, it would have ended sooner, for the peaceful folk, the vast majority of England, would have gone over to the party which seemed most likely to rule with a firm hand. The chronicler of St. Albans, Wedhamsted, shows how the plundering done by the northern men of Queen Margaret's army, when they came south after the Battle of Wakefield, was bitterly resisted, and greatly damaged the Lancastrian cause. This plundering is mentioned as an exceptional occurrence. During the period of the wars, the price of living in the country districts was not high. Wages were good, and employment does not appear to have been difficult to obtain. The 15th century was a period of prosperity and content. The Wars of the Roses did not affect the country at large. Of the country gentlemen it is hardly necessary to speak. The Paston Letters give good evidence of their prosperous state. It is said that the grandfather of John Paston was a plain husbandman, and his grandmother a bondswoman, that is, a woman of villain parentage. Yet the son, William, of this humble and frugal couple became a judge, and the grandson, John, was a substantial squire in Norfolk. He could afford to educate his sons in the best way, in the Duke of Norfolk's household, at Eton, Oxford, or Cambridge. In the 17th century, in 1679, the representative of the Paston family was created Earl of Yarmouth. This is not the only instance in which prosperous squires of the Wars of the Roses founded great families. The towns of England also advanced in material well-being during this period. It has been observed that no town during the Wars of the Roses ever defended itself against an army. One reason for this was that the armies were not very dangerous. They were small, and the leaders could not risk popularity in the country in general by allowing the troops to plunder. The larger towns were able to take care of themselves. When the troops came into London, the citizens organized themselves to protect their property. But the towns had no wish to stand sieges. For one reason, they did not care enough for the struggle between Lancaster and York. For another, they had no good walls. Since the anarchic reign of King Stephen, the walls of English towns had been neglected, the stones had been used for building, the ditches had been filled up and used as new sites for houses. In the more remote districts, the Welsh March in the north, defences were necessary. But elsewhere, especially in the home counties, the disuse of fortifications shows the peacefulness and prosperity of the cities. During the 15th century, the towns took little part in politics. An exceptional case occurs in the year 1450, when Thomas Young, member for Bristol, was imprisoned for proposing in Parliament that the Duke of York be declared heir to the throne. But as a rule, they were sufficiently occupied with developing their trade. The old rigid system was breaking down. The towns were much less isolated from each other than formerly. The mere marching of Lancastrian or Yorkist armies through the country must have done much to extend the habit of intercommunication. Inside the towns, the strict domination by guilds and crafts could not be maintained. By the middle of the 15th century, the Merchant Guild, which controlled the general conditions of commerce in each chartered borough, seems to have become identified in many places with the mayor and corporation. The craft guilds, which organized the particular trades in each town, had also reached a high stage of development, beyond which they showed no tendency to progress. Their rules for the admission of members were strictly enforced. The fees and general expenses of membership were high. The apprentices complained that they were hampered greatly in their efforts to become in time themselves masters. The guild and craft system were really growing obsolete, and a steady movement toward freer trade was afoot. The guilds and crafts gradually began to confine themselves mainly to social and charitable functions. At the end of the 15th century, the Crown began to interfere with their trade restrictions. The law of Henry VII enacted that all new bylaws of guilds must be submitted to the scrutiny of the Lord Chancellor. Individual enterprise was becoming freer, for the regulations of Crown and Parliament were less hampering than those of the guilds, and thus the closeness of the old connection between the enjoyment of burgher rights and the exercise of a skilled craft tended to disappear. The prosperity of the towns in the 15th century is attested by the magnificence of the domestic architecture of the period, as well as by the sumptuary laws which in the latter half of the century the Parliament thought it necessary to enact. The position of London in the nation was unique by reason of its wealth, situation, and the enterprise of its citizens. The party, Lancastrian or Yorkist, which held London, held the kingdom. It is impossible to ascertain accurately the population of London, but to judge from figures that have been compiled for the beginning of the 15th century, it may be concluded that it had about 50,000 inhabitants. Although this seems small, it was between 3 and 4 times the population of any other town in England. York and Bristol, the next largest, had probably about 15,000. Richard of York and his son Edward IV were popular in London. Edward was always a well-known figure there, and frequently borrowed money from some rich citizens. He gave London a new charter in 1464 and another in 1467. During the brief restoration of Henry VI in 1470, the right of electing their own mayor was taken from the Londoners. But Edward IV, on his return to power, at once gave the right to the citizen body. His politic alliance with the Duke of Burgundy was another benefit to the city, for it made trade with the wealthy cities of Flanders easy and profitable. That commerce flourished during the period of the Wars of the Roses is proved by the number of foreign merchants who found it worth their while to reside in English towns, chiefly, though not entirely, in London. These aliens were not popular with the English merchants. as may be seen from the well-known poem, The Libel of English Policy, written in 1436, for it was felt that foreign merchants were given advantages in England which English merchants were not given in foreign parts. As early as 1406, foreign merchants had been prohibited by statute from carrying on retail trade in England. But their wholesale trade continued to flourish. In London, the Easterlings, merchants from Hanseatic cities, had their own society, with offices and warehouses at the Steelyard, on the north bank of the river, on a site in Upper Thames Street. Edward IV even risked his popularity by protecting them and continuing their privileges, and in this he showed his wisdom. Henry VII took up his policy with this difference, that the Tudor king took more care to insist upon reciprocal privileges to Englishmen in German markets. End of section 29. Section 30 of The Wars of the Roses by Robert Balmain Mowat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 20, English Society During the Wars of the Roses, Part 2. The Church in England had an important part in the national life during the 15th century. The Archbishop of Canterbury was always recognized as the first constitutional adviser of the Crown. The prelates were a distinguished body of men, sometimes of the highest birth, like Cardinal Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, the grand-uncle of Henry VI. Sometimes sprung from yeoman parents, like Archbishop Chicheley, who died in 1443, the founder of All Souls College, or Bishop Waynflete, the founder of Magdalen Hall in the University of Oxford. In England, the Church had always been strongly national. From the time of William the Conqueror, the sovereign rights of the English crown over churchmen had been jealously guarded. But under the Lancastrian kings, who figured throughout as strictly orthodox sons of the Catholic Church, the claims of the Pope were again advanced. This was the more easily done under the pious and weak rule of Henry VI. The Pope was allowed to fill up English sees by provision. Even a few Italian absentees were permitted to enjoy the fruits of English dioceses. The interference of the papacy with the appointment of bishops and abbots was all the greater encroachment on the national liberties, because the bishops and mitred abbots had a majority in the House of Lords. The average attendance of temporal peers was a little under 40. The bishops and mitred abbots could number 46. The docility of the Lancastrian kings toward the papacy really strengthened the reaction towards a strong national control, which is so marked under the first two Tudor monarchs. The Church was wealthy and powerful, the monasteries being great landowners. Yet, as the lists compiled at the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII show, the wealth of the Church was not so great as people thought. The great landed corporations had suffered from the rise in wages and the decay of tillage which took place after the Black Death and Peasants' Revolt. Intellectually, too, the Church had suffered from its very strength. Aided by the secular arm under the Lancastrians, she had reduced Lollardy to feebleness and obscurity. But in doing this, the Church had herself suffered. She lacked the stimulus of opposition. She dominated the schools of learning too strictly for intellectual liberty. The best intellect among the clergy was that of Reginald Peacock, Bishop of Chichester. He was tried by the Archbishop and was compelled to resign his see in 1457. Although in the 15th century noble foundations arose in Oxford and Cambridge, their record of achievement in the domain of learning is not great. This intellectual barrenness reacted on the condition of the Church. It affected the mental vigor of candidates for ordination. It was not until the revival of learning reached England from the Continent that a successful effort was made to renew the intellectual spirit of the national Church and the universities. Bishop Fox's foundation at Corpus Christi College, Oxford, in 1516, in its early brilliant history, showed the Renaissance at its best. A little was done, too, under the Yorkist kings. Caxton enjoyed the favour of Edward IV. And Richard III., and had the support of a royal pension. John Tiptoft, Earl of Worcester, Constable, and Butcher of England, was a graduate both of Balliol and Padua, a student of Greek, and a supporter of Caxton. But the intellectual record of the Church under the Yorkists cannot be reckoned high. The chief components of the clerical estate of the realm were the prelates, the lower secular clergy, and the regulars or monastics. Of these, the great bishops in the period of the Wars of the Roses are mainly to be noticed in their attempts to keep the peace. Archbishop Neville of York, it is true, acted something of the part of an intriguer, and is too often found co-operating in the ambitious schemes of his great brother Warwick, in Yorkshire or Calais or London. But Thomas Berchier, who was Archbishop of Canterbury from 1454 to 1486, acted a better part. His proclivities were distinctly Yorkist, and in some ways, notably when Edward IV. Had to flee the country in 1470, he definitely assisted the Yorkist king. But from the first to last, he tried to moderate the rancour of parties, as in the pacification in St. Paul's on March 25, 1458. Perhaps his desire for peace led him to acquiesce rather too facilely in the accomplished work of the strong hand, as when he consented to the coronation of Richard III. The lower secular clergy seem to have pursued their even way in the 15th century. As has already been noticed, the state of learning among them was not high. According to Bishop Peacock of Chichester, the best men were not attracted into the church, because promotion among the lower ranks of the clergy was rare. Throughout the 15th century they seem to have ceased attending through their proctors or delegates in Parliament. Instead, they taxed themselves for national purposes in the convocations, which generally met about the same time as Parliament. The numbers of the secular clergy were very large. Ordinations were held 4 times a year, and on each occasion about 100 candidates were admitted to holy orders. They could all read and write at least, but they were too numerous for all of them to have cures of souls. Thus, besides the respectable and useful parish priests, there was a large number of clergy who had no definite charge, but gained a precarious living by saying masses for the dead. Such priests are said to have comprised actually a majority of the clergy. Idle and celibate, their moral standard was not high. The monastic clergy emerge into history through the chronicles which they still compiled, such as the Chronicle of Croyland in Lincolnshire or of St. Albans. The Wars of the Roses seem to have left them untouched. Henry VI was too orthodox to allow his men much license, and Edward IV never showed any ill feeling against the monks. Monasteries, indeed, exercised a wholesome influence in moderating the rigour of civil war. It was in the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey that Edward's wife, Queen Elizabeth, took refuge when her husband had to flee the country in 1470, and it was while in sanctuary that the Queen gave birth to a son, the ill-fated Edward V. After the 2 battles of St. Albans, the monastery of that town offered a Christian burial to the dead. After the Battle of Tewkesbury, the abbey there performed a similar pious duty, and was able even to save the lives of the less distinguished of the fugitives who sought for sanctuary. The monks of the time seem to have led a life to which little objection could be taken. They are known to have been charitable towards strangers and poor people. They performed their religious services and helped out the parochial system. But their usefulness in the 15th century cannot be placed very high. The historians of Croyland and St. Albans have nothing to say about the monks' intellectual accomplishments, about their industry, learning, or teaching. They have very little indeed to say about the religious life at all. The monks were interested in the political events of the time. An occasional visit from the king excited them. But the domestic questions, to judge from the chronicles, which interested them most intimately, were bound up with their endowments. They had to be very wary, or some skilful and unscrupulous man at court might get a conveyance of some of the monastic land. They had to be careful to safeguard their exemptions from the Statute of Mortmain. They had to keep an eye upon the Privy Council. The truth is, probably, that the monasteries were no longer very wealthy. It was difficult for them to adjust themselves to the changing conditions of agriculture. They did not get the pick of the population, for the most enterprising men preferred the great and popular callings of the soldier, the lawyer, and the merchant. The monks were out of the mainstream of national life. They did little to justify their existence. They neglected their opportunities, for instance, of becoming great educational centres, for which they were well fitted. The need for education was supplied by the great colleges of secular, not monastic priests, founded by Henry VI, Eton and King's College, just as in the previous century William Wykeham had turned aside from the monastic system for his noble educational foundations of Winchester and New College. The Wars of the Roses were fought chiefly under the influence of the barons, who with their retainers formed the bulk of every small army that fought in the battles. The number of barons was not high, although their property, taken altogether, was very large. In the time of Edward I, the dignity of a baron seems to have depended on his receiving a summons to Parliament. But from about the year 1446, barony by patent superseded barony by writ. Thus the highest number of barons existing at one time in the reign of Henry VI was probably 67 or 68. But the number in Parliament varied, for during the Wars of the Roses the king naturally did not summon his enemies who were in the field. The average number of barons summoned in the reign of Henry VI was about 48 or 49. The largest number summoned by Edward IV at one time was 50. It would be difficult to draw up lists showing the lords of the Lancastrian and Yorkist parties respectively, for the same family was not always on the same side. For instance, the Lord Audley, who was killed fighting for Lancaster at the Battle of Blore Heath in 1459, was succeeded by his son, a Yorkist Lord Audley, a companion of Warwick and Edward of March at Calais in 1460. Another lord, the Earl of Devonshire, supported Richard of York in the critical year of 1452, but is found fighting for King Henry VI at the First Battle of St. Albans in 1455. However, such instances are rare. On the whole, noble families remained consistent in their attachments. "I saw," wrote Philippe de Comines in his memoirs, "the Duke of Exeter, but he concealed his name, following the Duke of Burgundy's train, barefoot and bare-legged, begging for his bread from door to door. This person was the next of the House of Lancaster, and had married King Edward's sister. Although, like Sir Ralph Percy, they sometimes made terms with the enemy, yet they generally returned to the old attachment. They saved the bird in their bosom." It has often been said that the Wars of the Roses were a series of factious fights between great barons, yet the Yorkist party, which was ultimately victorious, numbered much fewer barons than the Lancastrian. The Yorkist king could not have won if he had only had his baronial supporters. Other classes had opinions and made them felt. The middle classes held ultimately the balance of power. A majority of the peers undoubtedly supported the Lancastrian cause. The Yorkist peers included many barons, but their opponents had most of the higher ranks of nobility. Thus among the Lancastrians were the Duke of Somerset, Beaufort; the Duke of Exeter, Holland; the Duke of Buckingham, Stafford; the Earls of Northumberland, Percy; Westmoreland, Neville; Pembroke, Tudor; Shrewsbury, Talbot; Oxford, De Vere; Devonshire, Courtenay; Wiltshire, Butler; The Yorkist list is much shorter. It included 2 dukes, Norfolk and Suffolk, but few earls. The chief are Salisbury and Warwick, that's Neville, Essex, Berkshire, Worcester, Tiptoft, and Arundel, Fitzalan. Among barons, the Lancastrians had a strong majority. Chief among these were Lords Clifford, Roos, Beaumont, Lisle, Stanley, Hungerford, Lovell, Rivers, Wells. The chief Yorkist barons were the Lords Bonville, Sturton, Scroop, Lumley, and several marcher lords, with the addition of some baronies which were in the families of the Earls of Essex and Salisbury. It cannot be said that any part of the country was definitely Lancastrian or Yorkist. In practically every county both parties were represented. The Yorkists were very strong on the Welsh March, especially in the centre, where were the great estates belonging to the earldom of March, to which Richard, Duke of York, had succeeded. There he had the castles of Ludlow and Wigmore. But the Lancastrians were also strong in Wales, for in the north they had the earldom of Chester, held by the crown, and in the south they had the lordship of Monmouth, belonging to the House of Lancaster, and the Tudor earldom of Pembroke. In the north of England, the Duke of York had the lordship of Wakefield, with the great castle of Sandal nearby, while the Earl of Warwick had the castle of Middleham. But the Lancastrian party was even stronger, for the Earl of Northumberland had great estates both in Northumberland and in Yorkshire. Another Lancastrian, Lord Clifford, had his seat at Skipton, and the Earl of Westmoreland, also Lancastrian, controlled a great part of the country from which he took his title. In the east there were the powerful Yorkist Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, but Lincoln had the Lancastrian Lord Wells, along with the Yorkist Lord Cromwell. Essex had the Lancastrian Earl of Oxford, but the Yorkist Earl of Essex, although he had not his chief interest there, was not without property and influence. Even in Norfolk and Suffolk there was a great deal of Lancastrian interest held by Lord Molins and others. In the south the 2 parties were mingled. Kent, partly owing to the interest of Lord Cobham, was Yorkist, and the Earl of Arundel, Yorkist, was strong in Sussex. But curiously enough, so was the Lancastrian house of Percy at Petworth. The Beaufort family had estates in Dorset and Somerset, the Earl of Devonshire in Devon, but the Yorkist Earl of Salisbury had estates in Dorset as well as in Wiltshire. In the Midlands the 2 parties must have been fairly equally balanced. The Earl of Warwick had the castle of that name, but attached to the Duchy of Lancaster, held by Henry VI, were many castles, honours, and manors, scattered everywhere over the Midlands. The truth is that the great families of England had so frequently intermarried that nearly every noble house which survived had ceased to be purely local, and now held estates and much local influence in widely different parts of the country. Any coloured map of England accurately showing all the distribution of Yorkist and Lancastrian estates would be a bewildering mosaic. The wealth of the barons during the Wars of the Roses was undoubtedly large. It is to be judged from the size of their households rather than from the amount of their incomes. It is very difficult to ascertain the value of money in the 15th century as compared with that of the present day. Then £500 was considered to be a sufficient income for a baron, so it may be supposed that money was much scarcer in those days, and that its purchasing power was at least 10 times greater than today. The households of the nobility were on a grand scale, from the king's, which numbered over 500 inmates and cost £13,000 annually, down to a baron's which had 25 people and cost £500. But many lords must have been a great deal wealthier, owing to their accumulation of the titles and estates of extinct families. It was this that made the barons a danger to order in England. There were too few of them, and their holdings in land were too great in proportion to the rest of the population. It has been estimated that the population of England in 1485 was about 3 millions. Yet while the population had been steadily increasing since the Black Death of 1349 and 50, the numbers of the baronage had been getting smaller. New creations were comparatively few, while the extinction of noble families through war and other causes was fairly common. The lands of extinct families were generally absorbed into some other house, either through intermarriage or by grant of the king. Thus the land collectively held by the baronage was not diminishing. In the first half of the 15th century it tended to increase, owing to grants out of the crown lands. So it came about that in the Wars of the Roses a comparatively small number of lords held a large amount of land. The individual barons were too powerful, having almost the influence of kings in their great domains. For this reason, although the middle classes really held the balance of power within the kingdom, particular barons were enormously powerful and exercised an influence out of all proportion to the numbers of their class. It was not until the Tudors began the long series of wise promotions from among the country gentry that the number of barons assumed once more a due proportion toward the other classes in the kingdom. The type of a great baron during the Wars of the Roses is, of course, the Earl of Warwick, picked out by Lytton to exemplify the last of the barons. He was indeed typical by reason of his wealth, his titles, his relatives. So magnificent was he in his housekeeping that at his table, it is said, 6 entire oxen were consumed every day. His retainers were numerous, and any of their friends could share in the earl's roasts and take away as much as could be carried on a long dagger. Wherever the Earl of Warwick happened to be living at the time, the neighbourhood taverns never lacked meat. He was wealthy not only because of his estates, but by reason of the high offices which he held under the crown. The governorship of Calais alone was said to be worth 1,500 crowns a year. In all, in the years between 1461 and 1471, he was considered to be in the enjoyment of pensions amounting annually to 80,000 crowns. This was a revenue almost fit for a king in those days. The family of Neville furnishes a good instance of the accumulation of lands and titles. Warwick himself succeeded to the great Beauchamp estates, and the title of Earl of Warwick in 1449 through his wife, Anne Beauchamp, heiress of the last earl. On the death of his father at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, he also became Earl of Salisbury. This earldom his father had himself acquired by marriage in 1425 with Alice, only child of Thomas de Montacute, 4th Earl of Salisbury. Warwick's 3 uncles, brothers of Salisbury, were also barons. William was Baron Fauconberg through his marriage about the year 1424 to Joan, heiress of the last Baron Fauconberg of Skelton Castle, Yorkshire. Edward was Baron Bergavenny through his marriage with Elizabeth, sole heiress of that barony, which carried with it estates in the valley of the Usk. George was Baron Latimer, a peerage which had been in the Neville family for 2 generations, but which had come to it by marriage. To these 5 peerages of the Yorkist Nevilles must be added the barony of Montague, granted to Warwick's brother John in 1461. Another brother, George, was Archbishop of York. The ramifications of this wonderful family did not end here, for the elder branch held the earldom of Westmoreland all through the Wars of the Roses, generally supporting the Lancastrian cause. Yet the Nevilles were not the only family with almost royal power in England. The Percys, with their estates in Northumberland, Yorkshire, and Sussex, were almost equally powerful. They had the advantage, too, of greater concentration, for they had not branched out into different lines like the Nevilles. It is their feud, or private war, with the Salisbury Nevilles, one of whose seats was at Middleham in Yorkshire, in 1449, that is taken by William of Worcester as the actual starting point of the Wars of the Roses. In the 15th century, a great lord lived like a king. He went with his enormous household from one castle to another, living at each place upon the produce of his estates. The style of housekeeping in a lord's castle is compared by Bishop Stubbs to that of a college at the present day. The number of servants was numerous. The food consumed was on a grand scale. Officials of good education and standing looked after the proper collection of rents and dues, the repair of buildings, the reception and distribution of food supplies. The accounts of a great lord were like those of a small kingdom. A regular staff of clerks was maintained to keep them properly. Every item was carefully entered in the right place. The seal of the lord was necessary to complete every important transaction, and lest anything should go amiss, all accounts were audited quarterly. The Register of John of Gaunt has been edited and published, giving a vivid idea of the elaborate, complex, and carefully managed system of a great medieval landholder. If the accounts of the Percys or Nevilles were published, they would show a similar great system. A high and wealthy nobleman of the Lancastrian period had in his estates and houses to learn the business of a public administrator and treasurer. This is why in the Middle Ages it was possible for a noble suddenly to be made constable or treasurer of England. It was no new work to him, only on a somewhat bigger scale than what he had already known. This state of things was not without certain advantages for the country at large. The noble was a man trained in the habits of business, with some knowledge of the law as well as of military science. His household was a school where youths of good birth might learn manners and something of business too. The estates, carefully administered, maintained large numbers of well-to-do tenants, the famous yeomen of the wars between England and France. But the influence of the lord as a centre of social life was greatly misused when he took to distributing his honourable badge to all manner of men who had no claim either as his tenants or as members of his household. This evil system of livery, as the wearing of a lord's badge came to be known, spoiled all chance of law and order in the country during the Lancastrian period. Any man of lawless inclinations, disbanded soldier, hardy vagrant, highway robber, might apply for the badge of some lord. The lord, with an eye to civil war in the near future, might readily consent to increase the number of his clients by the easy grant of a badge. The rascal thus publicly marked as the client of the Earl of Warwick or Northumberland was protected as by a government's uniform. He had assumed a quasi-legal position under cover of which he might commit acts gravely detrimental to the public peace. Frequent statutes bear witness to the prevalence of this evil. In the reign of Henry IV, it was enacted that no one should receive badges except bona fide servants or tenants of a lord. Otherwise, badges might only be worn when men were on active service on the marches. But the law was evaded and publicly flouted. The evil practice went on through the century. Edward IV did something to restrain it, but it was not until the reign of Henry VII that livery and maintenance were definitely suppressed through the agency of the Star Chamber. End of section 30. Section 31 of The Wars of the Roses by Robert Balmain Mowat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 21. The Breakdown of Government under Henry VI. Although organized society continued to exist during the Wars of the Roses, the credit of this cannot be imputed to the Lancastrian administration. The framework of government existed, but its force was gone. One condition of firm and orderly government is financial stability. This requisite the administration of Henry VI, like that of the French monarchy before the Revolution, did not possess. Indeed, the evil went further back. In the reign of Henry IV, the meagre revenue of the kingdom, estimated at an average of £106,000, generally sufficed just to cover the normal expenses of government. There can never have been anything but the barest surplus at the end of a year, and any extraordinary expenditure for war was apt to cause a tremendous deficit, so that the revenue of the next year would have to be anticipated. Such anticipations crippled the future government. In 1411, for instance, it has been calculated that the estimated revenue only brought in a little over £48,000, while the expenditure was over £64,000. In the reign of Henry V, the French war caused a continual deficit. The average revenue, £115,000 net, was little larger than under the former king. Yet the wages of the English forces in France, if actually paid, would alone have absorbed £90,000 a year. The expenses of the campaign of Agincourt had not all been met at the death of Henry V. Thus the administration of Henry VI started with a load of debt and never got free from it. The French war, which continued with intervals till 1453, was a bottomless gulf for the revenue of England. The French provinces themselves could make hardly any contribution. The Duchy of Guienne in 1433 furnished towards its expenses only a little over £77. In this year the Treasurer of England, Lord Cromwell, furnished a most gloomy financial statement. He was able to rely on only £38,364 for revenue, while the expenditure was £56,878. In addition, the Crown was in debt nearly £165,000. Even the king's household could not be properly maintained. A poem of 1450 said that King Henry beggeth from door to door. The exaggeration contains a good deal of truth. As the administration became more disorganized, the amount of revenue naturally tended to decrease. Between 1428 and 1454, the average gross revenue of the Crown was about £84,000. Between 1454 and 1461, it was under £59,000. The difference was due in the second period to the absence of parliamentary grants. Although the government badly needed money, it could not get it from Parliament. Instead, it had to rely on the old Crown revenues, Crown lands, and the farm of the shire, and on the customs, which were levied at the same rate all through the reign. As the king was unable to live on his own without any subsidy from Parliament, the government had to resort to the bad principle of resuming alienated Crown lands, that is, taking back without compensation the portions of the royal estates which had previously been granted away. It had been doubtless a very unwise policy to give away the estates of the Crown, but to take them back again by a comprehensive and compulsory act of Parliament would have caused a revolution in the social and economic life of the landed classes. The Crown could not have stood the strain of such a shock. Accordingly, the Acts of Resumption, the first of which was passed in 1450, were burdened with so many exceptions that they did little to replenish the revenues of the Crown. Thus, during the years between 1454 and 1461, the Lancastrian government was practically bankrupt, not because the country lacked money, but because the government was too weak to induce the people to contribute. Another evidence of the weakness and failure of the Lancastrian government is the breakdown of the legal system. It was an age of great litigiousness, and yet respect for justice was not enforced. Men took justice into their own hands and became a law for themselves. Yet the country had good and learned judges, men like Yelverton, Littleton, Fortescue, and attorneys were so numerous that the Crown and Parliament in vain tried to restrict them. The central courts could not control the great lords, and the local courts dared not. Poorer people were lawless too. The woods were often infested with robbers, and travelling was unsafe. The stories of the dangers from robbers to which Queen Margaret was exposed in her wanderings prove at least that the age was familiar with the idea of public insecurity. The history of the robber, Roger Church, who was bailiff of the hundred of Blowfield, and who had a regular band of ruffians in Norfolk in 1452, is only one out of many other instances. Evidence of the breakdown of the legal system is scattered broadcast through the past and letters, and may be gathered from other and less local sources of history. Even the Crown itself, or at any rate its advisers, was not above reproach. The oath administered to judges obliged them to do justice, even if the king by his letters or by word of mouth should order the contrary. Apparently, when a lawsuit was coming on in a county court, the sheriff might receive letters from the king ordering him to pack the jury, with a view to obtaining a particular kind of verdict. Also the sheriff informed us that he hath writing from the king that he shall make such a panel to acquit the Lord Molins. The dispute between the heir male and the heirs general of the House of Berkeley seems to have been carried on by intermittent private warfare from 1421 to 1475. The disputants had recourse to the law also, but this did not prevent them from trying to settle it by the strong hand. The evils of livery and maintenance must often have reduced the courts held in the counties to a farce. At the sessions of Oyer and Terminer, held on May 4th, 1451, at Walsingham in Norfolk, Sir Thomas Tuddenham and his ally John Hayden, lawyer, were indicted for wrongs done in the county at various times, and the said Tuddenham, Hayden, and other oppressors of their set come down thither, as I understand, with 400 horse and more, and considering how their well-willers were assembled at their instance, it had been right jeopardous and fearful for any of the plaintiffs to have been present. The Crown, indeed, was weak. The elements of disorder were strong. There was no governance. National defence was another duty which the government of Henry VI performed badly. The English Empire in France was completely lost by 1453. The narrow seas were badly guarded. The libel of English policy contrasts the weakness of England on the sea in 1436 with the firm policy of Henry V. "Where bin our ship? Where bin our swords become?" the poet exclaims, and he gives, as much needed advice to the king, "Cherish merchandise, keep the admiralty, that we be masters of the narrow sea." But after the loss of the French provinces, there was no improvement in English naval power. Even on the sea England now seemed hopeless. The expedition of the Norman Pierre de Brezé, which stormed and plundered Sandwich in August 1457, shows how feeble was English sea power. This happened at a time when there was no civil war at home. Warwick, as admiral, did something to re-establish English naval reputation, but the Crown had no control over him. Among the sailors, the government was not able to maintain discipline. In January 1450, Adam Molins, Bishop of Chichester, sent down by the government to Portsmouth to pay the wages of Sir Thomas Curiel's men, was murdered by the soldiers and sailors. Such men were not in a good condition to defend the country. A crowning proof of the feebleness of Henry VI's government is its total inability to deal promptly with the Kentish rising of Jack Cade in 1450. The king had to fly to Kenilworth, leaving the capital exposed to the insurgents. The weakness of the executive cannot be ascribed to the liberal constitutionalism of Henry VI. The Lancastrian experiment, limited constitutional monarchy, had no existence after the year 1437. At first, it is true, the monarchy was eminently constitutional. The council, which was the executive body of the crown, consisting of advisers and ministers of the king, was in the year 1404 nominated in Parliament. That is to say, the members of council were appointed with the approval of Parliament. From this year until the 15th year of the reign of Henry VI, the councillors were regularly approved by Parliament. In the first year of his reign they were formally appointed by statute. Thus, during the first half of the Lancastrian period, there was a definite correspondence between council and Parliament. The council was a link between Parliament and the king, and thus may be considered a forerunner of the modern cabinet system. But from the year 1437, King Henry VI began to nominate the council absolutely, without reference to the Parliament. He was then just under 16 years of age and was considered old enough to be his own master. From this time, the close correspondence between council and Parliament ceased. It became, in fact as well as in name, the King's Council, without responsibility to Parliament. The result was disastrous to the Crown. For the odium of unpopular measures and failures, which would have fallen only upon the ministers if they had been responsible to Parliament, was gradually passed from the ministers to the king, whose mere servants they were. The Dukes of Suffolk and Somerset are instances of ministers and councillors retained by the king against powerful and consistent opposition from a large section in Parliament. The Duke of York is an instance of a man eminent in the country and desired by a large number in Parliament, yet excluded from the ministry and even from the council. It was from 1444 that Suffolk became chief minister of the king. That year saw the triumph of the policy of peace, which Cardinal Henry Beaufort so strongly advocated. Suffolk was at the head of the embassy which carried through the peace with France, and arranged the marriage of King Henry with the French princess Margaret. In 1447, the council, chiefly under the influence, or so men thought at the time, of Suffolk, put Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the king's uncle, under arrest. On the 23rd of February, Gloucester was dead. The good Duke Humphrey, the last of the king's council who was really popular in Parliament and in the country. In the same year, April 1447, died Cardinal Beaufort. Suffolk was left almost alone in the king's confidence and supreme in the council. The unpopularity of Suffolk is amply proved by the reports which were publicly spread abroad through the country against him, and by the political poems which were written at the time of the loss of Normandy. As early as 1447, he felt it necessary to deny these reports in front of the council and to make an explicit defence of himself. The country as a whole would gladly have seen him retire from the council, but King Henry, perhaps through the influence of Queen Margaret, held to him all the more, raising him in 1448 from an earl to a duke. The impeachment of Suffolk in 1450, although perhaps prompted by Lord Cromwell, was enthusiastically taken up by the Commons. But King Henry still went on acting as an absolute monarch, and by his own advice, and not reporting him to the advice of his lords, stopped the trial and sent Suffolk abroad. This led to the Duke's murder at sea, apparently an act not disapproved of in the country. King Henry's adherence to the Duke of Somerset was equally against the spirit of the Lancastrian experiment. The Duke of York, in 1445, had concluded a period of not unsuccessful government in Normandy. In 1447, King Henry reappointed him for 5 years, but immediately, under the influence of Somerset, cancelled the appointment. York was made Lieutenant of Ireland so as to be out of the way. Somerset went to Normandy as lieutenant and was made Duke in 1448. His period of government was the most disastrous in the whole course of the 100 Years' War. Then, after the great failure of English arms abroad, and after the rebellion and trouble made by Jack Cade at home, York and Somerset both came back to England. There was no doubt which of them most people would have liked to see become the king's adviser. Somerset was thoroughly unpopular, and York, owing to that unpopularity, gained the character of a popular champion. Yet Henry seems not to have hesitated for a moment. Somerset was made Constable of England, and from that time till his death had the ear of the king. There is no need to pursue this theme further. King Henry never consented to remove Somerset from the council and to admit York, except when compelled by force of arms. But any revival of the king's power saw Somerset again chief adviser. If Henry had acted constitutionally, if he had dismissed the minister who was disliked, and have given his confidence to the other, the Duke of York would have had no excuse for rebellion, and no one in the country would have had any excuse for following him. The administrative system of the country was unsound. The legislative system was in no better condition. Parliament was poisoned at the fountainhead. The election of members was frequently corrupt. This evil was at first largely due to interference from local magnates, but the Crown itself was not above exercising a sinister influence. The election of borough members, although the franchise was often monopolized by a comparatively small oligarchy of the town, was probably the freest part of the parliamentary system. County elections were adversely affected, like everything else, by the evil of livery. Henry IV did what he could to amend matters. In 1406 an important statute was passed to the effect that the knights of the shire should be elected freely in the county court, without regard to any pressure from without, and that as a guarantee of free election, the return of the successful candidate's name should be made on an indenture, signed with the names and bearing the seals of all who took part in the election. This law was specially intended to prevent the sheriff from making a false return under pressure from some great man. It would also tend to prevent pressure from the Crown. But to judge from the names given in the subsequent indentures, the number of electors cannot have been large. As few as 8 sometimes appended their seals. 30 was a large number, and appears only in the most populous counties. Very occasionally the number rose to 40. A small body of voters might easily be subjected to outside pressure from men like Tuddenham and Haydon, with their 400 bravos. Still, the indentures before the year 1430 show that all classes of people took part in the elections, down apparently to simple yeomen. Of course, many more persons would often take part in elections than those who actually sealed the indentures. Notwithstanding that by statute all were bound to add their seals, a return signed by a few to represent all the rest was accepted as valid. In 1430 a change was made in the qualification for the county franchise, which must considerably have diminished the number of voters. Hitherto, elections had taken place in full county court. To the county court or shire mote, everyone had the right of coming who was a freeholder or above that rank. Below freeholders, who could come personally, were the villeins, who were represented by the 4 best men and the reeve from each manor in the county. But a statute of 1430 enacted that only men who had a 40-shilling freehold should be qualified as electors. This law must have cut the villeins entirely out of elections, and must also have excluded all yeomen whose land had an annual value of less than 40 shillings. The object of this restriction was to make the elections more orderly. The statute stated that the election of members of Parliament had often been carried through by the rabble. This is no doubt true. Still, the smaller the number of voters, the greater might be the chance of undue influence from some high and mighty source. In the same spirit, an act was passed in 1445 stating that no one below the degree of knight should be elected member for the shire. Thus, the whole yeoman class was cut out of the body that might supply members of Parliament. The restriction was probably no cause of grief to the yeoman, and it may have made no actual change in the class of men returned before or after 1445. But it was not a change in the spirit of that constitutionalism which has been so often credited to Henry VI. Interferences in elections by the Crown itself were by no means unknown. In 1404 the writ of summons from Henry IV, following a precedent set by Edward III, ordered that no lawyers should be returned as members to the Parliament of that year, which accordingly has since been known in history as the Unlearned Parliament. In 1459, after the discomfiture and flight of the Yorkists at Ludford, a Parliament was summoned to Coventry, where the opponents of the king's party were formally attainted. The Commons in this case were returned by the sheriffs after the receipt of Privy Seal letters from the Crown, naming the persons who were to be elected. When such a cynical violation of all parliamentary liberty was carried out, it seems hardly sufficient to cite the origination of money grants in the Commons as a significant proof of the position which the House of Commons had already won under the constitutional rule of Lancaster. Another breach of privilege of Parliament is the imprisonment of Thomas Young, member for Bristol, for proposing in the Parliament of 1451 that the Duke of York should be declared heir to the crown. There was nothing treasonable or unlawful in such a proposition, as York was undoubtedly the heir presumptive, in default of any issue to Henry and Margaret, who were still childless after 5 years of married life. The privilege of Parliament ought effectually to have preserved Young from suffering for making a proposition not unlawful, though distasteful to the king. But the constitution was violated. Young had to go to the Tower. It is not enough to reply that the Yorkist princes acted unconstitutionally too. The condemnation of the House of York does not imply the acquittal of the House of Lancaster. End of section 31. Section 32 of The Wars of the Roses by Robert Balmain Mowat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 22. The Work of Edward IV. The House of Lancaster fell because it failed to govern the kingdom and to keep order. The claim of the House of York was accepted as being likely to lead to peace, order, regular administration. Such peace and order were found on the whole under the Tudor monarchs. Did the House of York, in its short period of power, give firm governance too? The great historian of the English Constitution answers this question in the negative. England found no sounder governance under Edward IV than under Henry VI. The court was led by favourites, justice was perverted, strength was pitted against weakness, riots, robberies, forcible entries were prevalent as before. The House of York failed, as the House of Lancaster had failed, to justify its existence by wise administration. Yet although much unconstitutional conduct can be imputed to the House of York, it is not so easy to find instances of weak or incompetent administration. If attention be concentrated on the reign of Edward IV, it will be found to be, in the last 12 years, a reign of comparative peace and prosperity, as indeed was the reign of his brother Richard, the turmoil in whose mind did not much disturb the even life of his subjects. The reign of Edward IV must be divided into 2 periods. The first is from his accession as king on March 4, 1461, to October 1470, when he had to fly to Flanders, leaving King Henry VI to enjoy a brief period of restoration at the hands of the Earl of Warwick. The second period is from April 1471, when Edward once more and finally regained his kingdom, to his death at Westminster on April 9, 1483. It is during this first period that there is found the lack of governance which Bishop Stubbs applies to the whole reign. During the second period, peaceful, if not constitutional, government was certainly found. It is unnecessary to repeat again the story of the years 1461 to 1470, The troubled years of Edward IV, when the Lancastrian party was still strong in the north and the west of England, when the northern castles still held out, and a Scottish army was frequently in occupation of portions of the English soil. The young and inexperienced King Edward, fresh from the rough life of the camp, with the too powerful Neville family as his chief support, was not in a position to put an end to all the ills which had been felt under his predecessor. So the country remained unsettled in all the remoter parts, and a number of disturbances took place, culminating in the rising of Robin of Redesdale. The plot of the Earl of Warwick was successful. King Edward had to flee the country. Far different was the state of affairs after the battles of Barnet and Tewkesbury, when he was once more re-established in his kingdom. The Lancastrian line was extinct. The House of Neville was laid low. King Edward had learned much from his exile. Instead of the careless soldier depicted by de Comines, he was now the prudent monarch of the new school which was rising in Western Europe on the ruins of feudalism, to embody the independence of the national states. Edward IV, like Louis XI, belonged to that new monarchy whose raison d'être and whose philosophy of life had been laid down for ever by Machiavelli and the Prince. Edward had learned by his mistakes and his misfortunes. He was resolved never again to go upon his travels. His strong, if ruthless, rule gave England that internal order and that external independence which all nations demand for their sovereign governments. This, too, was the service of the early Tudor kings. They were autocrats, ruling with the approval of the country, subject to certain limitations implied by this approval. Edward IV was a monarch of the same sort. He laid down the lines along which the Tudors followed, not consciously indeed, but because the conditions of the age demanded that policy from any monarch who would keep his throne. 6 distinct ways may be noted in which Edward IV directed his energy for the governing of England. He strengthened the administration of the law. He encouraged the rise of a new nobility, personally attached to the crown. He kept the expenditure and the revenue of the government at a low but adequate figure. He summoned few parliaments. He conducted the affairs of England abroad peacefully, with the backing of armed force, but mainly by a clever diplomacy. He encouraged trade and commerce by all the means then known to the crown. In these ways King Edward is a good type of the new monarchy. The Tudors trod in his paths. It was necessary for the law courts to show great firmness if the local disorder which had been such an evil under the Lancastrians was to be suppressed. Edward's methods were arbitrary, calculated to put down disturbers of the peace, but without sufficient regard to those broad and general principles of justice which are the safeguard of personal liberty when the executive government grows strong. The great danger from King Edward's policy was that the executive exercised influence over the judiciary. This was an undoubted evil which has always to be guarded against, but at the same time it had the effect of suppressing disorder. The times were rough and required rough measures. The ordinary law of the land had been emptied of most of its force under Henry VI. Edward IV used special tribunals which would not feel the territorial influence of disturbers of the peace. Such a tribunal was the Court of the High Constable, which under the administration of John Tiptoft, Earl of Worcester, became notorious for its severity. In a patent of 1462, King Edward authorized Tiptoft to hear all charges of high treason and to decide them, even summarily, plainly without noise and show of judgment on simple inspection of the fact. But the great butcher of England was killed in 1470, and by that time the Court of the High Constable had done most of its bloody work. From 1471 to the end of his reign, executions were infrequent. The trial of Clarence in 1478 was a public scandal, but few felt regret at his fate. The worst feature in the legal history of the time was the use of torture. Even if this was begun under Henry VI, Edward IV would not stand excused. Yet it is in the earlier unsettled period, up to 1470, that instances of the use of torture occur. The law did not err on the side of weakness. Only in the more remote districts of England can it be shown that the practice of livery and maintenance still went on. But even here the Yorkist kings anticipated the Tudor reforms. Edward IV set up the Council of Wales, a prerogative council, with special powers to deal out summary justice on the disturbed Welsh March. This court, which had much the same constitution and scope of action as the more famous Council of the North, established in 1437, lasted through the Tudor period, until the Long Parliament abolished it in 1641. The royal progress in 1484 of Richard III in the north parts is another instance of the interest of the Yorkist kings in preserving order in the most turbulent districts of England. He seems to have accomplished much, and in the north of England he was certainly strong in the affections of the people. The Council of Wales was not the only way in which Edward IV anticipated the legal system of the Tudors. The Court of Star Chamber, often ascribed to the Act of 3 Henry VII, sat in King Edward's reign, being a convenient means of enforcing order when the local courts were weak or the king's subjects too strong. Every monarch gathers round him an aristocracy to support his position and to supply him with administrators and governors. Edward IV used such of the old nobility as had been faithful to his house, and he drew upon the class of gentry for a new nobility to be faithful to the crown which had conferred its rank. The Woodvilles, although a Lancastrian family, were tied to the crown by the marriage of the king. Edward gave them his confidence, and they proved worthy of it. They were a new family when he distinguished them, but through the great marriages which he arranged, they soon numbered no less than 8 peerages. Another family, the Herberts, were raised to the earldom of Pembroke. There had been a barony in the Berkshire family under the Lancastrians, but Edward IV raised their status and multiplied their titles. They became one of the capable official families of the Yorkist and the Tudor periods. The nobility under the Yorkists assumed more and more the character which it bore later in the 16th century. The great quasi-royal houses like the Beauforts and the Hollands became extinct. The crown benefited by the addition of forfeited lands. The rest of the nobility took a lower position, with a sufficient degree of equality among themselves to prevent particular houses raising factions to divide the kingdom. Light taxation and moderate expenditure were characteristics of the new monarchy, whether Yorkists or Tudor. The Lancastrians had failed to live of their own. Edward IV managed better. His expenditure was not high. His demands for financial help from Parliament were infrequent. Without any rise in the rate of contribution, the receipts from customs, although they fluctuated considerably, automatically increased as commerce developed. The crown lands, augmented by forfeitures from nobles attainted in the Wars of the Roses, brought in larger sums than formerly. Extraordinary revenue was raised by the outrageous levying of benevolences, which, falling as they did upon a comparatively few wealthy people, seem to have been received without unpopularity in the country as a whole. The subsidy and the pension received from Louis XI by the terms of the Treaty of Picquigny in 1475 further added to the royal treasure and relieved the finances of the government. Edward's private trading ventures were another source of wealth. The total revenue, including the French pension, was not high, being between the years 1472 and 1483 of an average amount of £95,000 gross. Yet King Edward made this suffice. He left at his death a considerable fortune. His borrowing, excluding benevolences, was on a moderate scale, the total amount of loans not paid off at the end of his reign being calculated at £29,000. There is no modern government of any standing whose loan capital is only 1/3 of its revenue. In his economical administration, Edward IV was like Henry VII and Elizabeth. This characteristic of Yorkists and Tudors was by no means unpopular with the country. King Edward summoned few parliaments throughout his reign, and his record of legislation is mainly on the subject of commerce. In 1465 the king had been voted tonnage and poundage for life. Except for the abortive war with France in 1475, he had seldom again to apply to the Estates for money. Throughout his long reign of 21 years, only 6 separate parliaments were summoned. Their sessions were short, and the work they were called on to do was quickly finished. Sometimes years passed without any parliament meeting. There was none between May 1468 and October 1472. Between 1475 and 1483, the sitting of Parliament occupied only 42 days. It has been said that the reign of Edward IV is the first in English history in which no statute was passed to increase the liberty of the subject. But the country acquiesced in the abeyance of Parliament, for what the people wanted was a cessation from civil turmoil, so that commerce and ordinary occupations might go on uninterrupted. Henry VII adopted the same attitude toward Parliament. Practically all his useful legislation was done in the early years of his reign. The people were getting orderly government, and for the time they were contented. In foreign affairs, Edward IV anticipated the policy of Henry VII. The less blood he drew, the more he took of treasure. Each monarch took a great military expedition to France, and each returned home with financial subventions in lieu of military honours. Henry VII's Treaty of Étaples in 1492 much resembled Edward IV's Treaty of Picquigny in 1475. Both monarchs pursued a policy of peace abroad. They turned their back on the 100 Years' War, with all its hopeless ideals. They thought no more of a realm across the Channel. They recognized that England was an island kingdom, and that her genius lay in commerce and on the sea. In foreign affairs they were content to play a part, not with campaigns and battles like the medieval kings, but by diplomacy and treaties. England had by nature a commanding position. She dominated the great maritime highway that lay from Flanders to the Bay of Biscay, and led on to Spain and the Mediterranean. The alliance of England was equally valuable to Flanders, to France, and to Spain. England, courted on every side, had no need at this period to enter into expensive foreign wars. She could rise to greatness again without embroiling herself in Europe. This was clearly understood by Edward IV, by Henry VII, by Wolsey, by Elizabeth. They spent little of England's treasure or her men on the fields of Europe, so that the energy of her people took other directions, at home in England and abroad along the paths of the sea. In their strong support of commerce, Edward IV and Henry VII were alike. The new monarchy was indeed a sort of bourgeois monarchy, popular with all citizens, careful of the peace, careful of national defence, taking a personal interest in all affairs of trade. The great benefit conferred by Edward IV on English commerce was the renewal of the connection with Flanders and Burgundy. The Dukes of Burgundy had been the allies of England in the middle period of the 100 Years' War, from 1415 to 1435. But in 1435 Duke Philip had made peace with Charles VII of France, and thereafter the English connection was broken off. The Burgundian domains included Flanders, so that the loss of the alliance had a bad effect on the export of wool from England to that flourishing country. Calais itself was in continual danger of being taken by the Duke. But with the accession of Edward IV, the Flemish connection was gradually renewed. The marriage of Edward's sister Margaret with Duke Charles the Bold in 1468 made the link stronger. It had been preceded in the same year by a treaty guaranteeing freedom of commercial intercourse between England and Flanders for 30 years. This connection was a great asset for England. The accession of Henry VII interrupted good relations for a time, as Margaret, the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, naturally kept her Yorkist predilections. But at length the energetic and persistent diplomacy of Henry VII. Was crowned with success. With the Treaty of the Great Intercourse in 1496, the Flemish commercial connection was once more renewed, to the great joy of the English merchants. Edward IV. died on April 9th, 1483, in his 41st year, after a 10 days' illness. He had a low fever, which he is said to have contracted originally in the French expedition of 1475, and which was now much aggravated by dissipation. Philippe de Comines describes him as being in his youth the most beautiful man of his time, but afterwards he grew very corpulent. Clearly, however, he had a gift for ruling, and thoroughly understood his people's temper. For this reason he is to be classed as a successful monarch, under whom England prospered. End of section 32. Section 33 of The Wars of the Roses by Robert Balmain Mowat. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Pamela Nagami. Conclusion. The accession of Henry VII. When Edward IV. Had finally re-established himself by the Battle of Tewkesbury, Jasper Tudor, who had been Earl of Pembroke before his attainder, took his nephew Henry Tudor, the 14-year-old Earl of Richmond, away with him by sea from Pembrokeshire to safekeeping in France. Stress of wind compelled them to land, not in the domains of King Louis XI, but in those of Francis II, the last Duke of Brittany. Here Henry lived and grew up to manhood, waiting for an opportunity to make himself King of England. Henry Tudor, owing to the extinction of all the males of the House of Lancaster, was now the heir of John of Gaunt. His mother was the Lady Margaret Beaufort, only child of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, grandson of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford. The name of Tudor came from his father, Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, who was the son of Sir Owen Tudor, a Welsh knight of an old family, and Queen Catherine, widow of Henry V. and mother of Henry VI. Edmund, Earl of Richmond, had died toward the end of 1456, about 2 months before the birth of his son, on January 28, 1457. Henry, who was thus born Earl of Richmond, was brought up by his uncle Jasper, the Earl of Pembroke. The Tudors followed the House of Lancaster, and rendered energetic though ineffective service on the Welsh march and in the interior of Wales. The founder of the house, old Owen Tudor, was executed by the Yorkists at Hereford after the Battle of Mortimer's Cross in 1461. Young Henry was among the garrison which surrendered at Harlech after 7 years' siege in 1468. He was taken up to London, and was put under the guardianship of the new Earl of Pembroke, William Herbert. During the brief restoration of Henry VI in 1470 and 71, Henry, now 14 years of age, was restored to the care of his uncle, Jasper Tudor, who, after the ruin of the Lancastrian cause, carried him safely, as has been already noticed, to Brittany. Thither, after the death of the last prince of the direct male line of Lancaster, came the remnants of the party, the strong spirits who would not or could not go back and make their peace with the Yorkists. The Duke of Brittany, remembering the old alliance of his house with that of Lancaster, protected Henry and lent him money for any enterprise. In England he had friends like John Morton, Bishop of Ely, who kept him primed with information. Although occasionally threatened with capture, owing to the diplomatic pressure of Edward IV. Or Richard III., he escaped his enemies, and so was able to seize the critical moment for a return to his native land. Henry had watched the declining fortunes of the House of York after the death of Edward IV. He had heard of the murder of the boy king, Edward V., and of the young Prince Richard. He noted the rise of Richard III to power, the muttering among the nobles, and the apathy of the people. In October 1483 he planned to join the Duke of Buckingham, who was rising in rebellion in his favour in the south of England. The rising was a failure, and Henry, who had sailed from Brittany and appeared off Poole Harbour, turned straight back again. But by 1485 the time had come. The energy and capacity of King Richard had not made England love him or forget his crimes. Henry got his force ready. The French government, under the regent Anne of Beaujeu, openly favoured his aims and gave troops. With a mixed English and French force of 2,000 men, he started from Harfleur on August 1st, 1485, and sailed direct for Milford Haven, a region where the Tudor family had always great interest. He pushed northwards by Haverfordwest to Cardigan and Shrewsbury, many Welshmen joining his standard as he went along. At Market Bosworth in Leicestershire, on August 22nd, he met the army of Richard III. The forces were of the usual size during the Wars of the Roses. Henry had about 5,000 men, Richard perhaps somewhat more. The action of Sir William Stanley, who had brought up a strong force from Cheshire and Lancashire nominally to support King Richard, decided the day in favour of Henry. With the battle the crown was also won. The country as a whole seemed indifferent to the result, and accepted the new king without further difficulty. Henry VII was wise enough to rule England in the way his immediate predecessors had done, so that the change of dynasty scarcely interrupted the even course of life along which England had now for 15 years been making her way. End of section 33. Recording by Pamela Nagami, MD, in Encino, California, December 2019. End of the Wars of the Roses, 1377 to 1471, by Robert Balmain Mowat.